Muhammad claims to be a direct descendant of Ishmael. So my question is there any way of proving or disproving that?
So I've had a number of these conversations with my contacts across the ocean who get a result that perhaps is not what they hoped for. And I'll say you might still be related to Muhammad or to Abraham, but the Y chromosome may not record it, because you can have, let's say, 50 generations back to Muhammad, and 49 of the 50 are strict father-son links. One generation of father-daughter throws the entire analysis off, and the person I'm speaking to, their Y chromosome is going to be the result of whoever that daughter married.
I think Islam hates us.
They have done nothing except wreak havoc and terror for our faith and our religion.
Professed values of the Western countries, democracy and constitutional and human rights, at least they should speak about this.
And it's like, I feel like religion just is making it worse. They say they believe in God, but I think they're just anxious.
Before we talk about politics, let's look at the fundamental things.
That when we stand up to those who oppress our communities, that Allah accepts from us that as a form of jihad.
And it requires people with guts to follow God in an era that everyone does whatever is right in their eyes.
Will you distance yourself from those who think differently? Or will you join us at the table and talk about what is really important? This is the Al-Ma'idah Initiative, conversation without compromise.
Hey everyone, welcome back to the Al-Ma'idah Initiative podcast. We have a special episode today with Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson. How would you describe who you are and what you do, Nathaniel?
I think my title is Research Biologist at Answers and Geneticist, but I'm a biologist, geneticist by training, and do research for Answers and Genesis, which is a creation evolution ministry. So that's kind of my day job each day.
So just some context here. I would say my journey into the Christian faith. So I was raised in a Christian home, but went to a very sort of aggressively secular school in England. And I think I had a realization that Christianity was important when I was 13, but it wasn't until a few months later when someone took me to see Ken Ham in England in 2003 that I kind of gained a conviction that I myself could trust the Bible. And, deciding to take the Bible literally in a very secular all-boys school in England is probably the worst time to do that. But nevertheless, it really shaped my faith. So Answers in Genesis has been pretty instrumental in shaping my faith. And I needed all that stuff when I was 13. Now, mostly I'm talking to Muslims and New Age Seattleites. I don't meet any more sort of hardcore atheist materialists anymore, but it's still, occasionally fun to kind of revisit this because it was very foundational in my faith journey.
Excellent.
So one thing this has helped me with is being able to look at, a lot of mainstream materialist consensuses through different eyes. And I've read both of your books in the last month. I actually just started with the video about the sort of Native American histories, and that made me order. It made me get Traced. No, sorry, Traced. I read second, and then They Had Names is absolutely excellent. And you yourself are narrating the audiobook, so that's great. I also listened through Traced, which is free on Audible, and I need to go and read through this because there's so many references to some charts that you just can't see on an audiobook. So They Had Names works much better as an audiobook than Trace does. So probably if you want to look at Trace, you need to buy the book and actually look at the charts because there's so much visualized data in it. So what I want to know is, let's take the average genetic test and say 23andMe, that one everyone's familiar with. What is different about your approach to genetic data than a test like that?
There's a dirty little secret with these typical genetic tests. 23andMe is actually one of the better ones out there because they test 3 different types of DNA. Most genetic testing companies like Ancestry DNA, even if you buy a basic test from, let's say, Family Tree DNA, They're primarily looking at the autosomal DNA. That's the technical term for the DNA from both parents. It's about 99% of someone's DNA. And it's useful for figuring out both sides of the family tree. Wonderful tool, especially if someone's adopted or they don't know paternal or maternal ancestry, that sort of thing. Been a lot of fun to help people with their own histories that way when they share their results and we work through them. But the dirty little secret is it's only good for about a few generations. And the reason for that is kind of the other edge of the double-edged sword. It's DNA from both parents, good, but that means the DNA from each parent dilutes the signal from the other. So I'm 50% genetically each of my mother and father. They're 50% genetically each of their parents, my 4 grandparents, and so I'm 25% genetically each of my grandparents, in theory. Biology is always messy, and so it doesn't work out quite perfectly that way, at least with the tests that we have. Then if you look at great-grandparents, I'm 12.5%, then 6.25%. In other words, the genetic signal from previous generations drops off exponentially, and it's not really good for anything very deep in the past. What you need to do to go deep in the past, beyond just a few generations, and so I guess just to summarize what I just said, the typical genetic test only tells you basically what your grandparents were, which many of us already know from family trees without any DNA tests, so you're $100 poorer, but you don't know much more. Exceptions, of course, again, for adoptees and such. If you want to go deep in the past, you need something like Y chromosome DNA, which is inherited from fathers to sons. There's no female Y chromosome to dilute that genetic signal, so that can take us deep into the past. For the female side, there's mitochondrial DNA inherited from mothers to daughters, mothers to sons as well, but because the dad doesn't pass it on, it stops there. So I have my mother's mitochondrial DNA, my 4 children have my wife's mitochondrial DNA. It's a record of maternal ancestry. These two things can take you deeper into the past. So what I've been doing is working, I started off about 15 years ago primarily with mitochondrial DNA, just because there were thousands of sequences out there. It's small, it's easy to sequence. I was working on the larger question of the origin of species, of which humans were just one. But humans have billions of dollars of research behind them in the United States due to the National Institutes of Health. And so the project moved about 10 years ago into a more focused human history, human origins direction. And I also shifted from the female inherited mitochondrial DNA to the male inherited Y chromosome DNA for technical reasons. Just in short, for reasons no one's been able to figure out, the statistics for mitochondrial DNA are inferior to those for Y chromosome DNA. For example, if I take a Y chromosome test, you take a Y chromosome test, our common ancestor might be, let's say, AD 500 years after Christ. And the uncertainty for a Y chromosome test might be 100 years on either side of that, or 200 years. We can be fairly precise as to this was our ancestor, this guy back then, maybe this people group. Whereas with mitochondrial DNA, again, you and I both have it, even though it's inherited from mothers. Let's say the result that's reported is AD 500, same date for the Y chromosome. The uncertainty would be about 1,000 years either way. So is that the time of the fall of the Roman Empire, AD 500, or right after it? Or is it the time, 1,000 years earlier, 500 BC? Is it the time of the ancient Greeks? Is it the time of, if you go fast forward 1,000 years, AD 1500s? Is it the end of the Middle Ages? That's just a huge range that's practically useless for trying to figure out then who our common ancestor was on the maternal side. So that's why I focused on Y chromosome for a long time. I've begun to come back to the mitochondrial DNA just this year. I was able to solve some of the statistical problems. It's still statistically messy, and I proceed with caution. But there's been some big discoveries we were able to make with the Y chromosome, and I've continued to work in that direction.
Okay, so I'm curious how you describe, if there's a difference in methodology between, say, a secular materialist looking at Y chromosome DNA and the sort of creationist approach to Y chromosome DNA, where is like the divergence point as far as where the methodology will kind of like branch off? Because looking from what I can tell from listening to Trace, if I was paying attention properly, it seems like everything is basically on the same page until we're starting to look at those kind of immediate post-flood generations where you're making the argument that there's evidence that the older a man is when he has a child, the more Y chromosome mutations you have, that you can have. And so you're basically using that as a model of, well, because you have longer lifespans immediately post-flood, you can have more genetic variation, more genetic changes between father and son. Am I representing that right? Is that the main point of divergence, or are there others?
There's a number of points of divergence. I think it might be helpful just to think of it from a historical perspective. I'll first sketch the methods or the history of the methodology in the mainstream genetic approach. And it does flow out of the history of scientific research on the creation evolution issue for them. So naturally, because we're dealing with cell biology genetics, this is a fairly late in history discovery. Or going back to Darwin's day, he had no genetic data, didn't even know what was the substance of heredity. We take it for granted today that it's DNA. So he's working with fossils, he's working with geology, maybe some astronomy. Those are the primary fields for thinking about the age of the earth, thinking about the history of species, thinking about the origin of humanity. And so all that is basically laid down and in place as part of evolutionary dogma before DNA is established as the substance of heredity 100 years later, 1953 or so, after Darwin, Watson, and Crick. And then the human genome sequence, of course, first published 2001, Francis Collins, and then Craig Venter were the governmental and the sort of the I guess the industrial side of the project for the Human Genome Project. And all that to say, when the evolutionists approach this question, they basically take DNA differences and they overlay them on their conclusions that they've already determined from geology, paleontology, astronomy. So you can look this up. Just to give an example, there was a big project called the 1,000 Genomes Project. It was actually more than 1,000, but kind of a round number, trying to sample major populations of people around the globe. I think it was about 26 major population centers and different ethnicities. And the Y chromosome data, so I think it was about around 1,200 men that were part of that study. They looked at their Y chromosomes, their male inherited DNA, compared them, and one of the specific tests they did to make sure that their conclusions would come out correctly according to their standards, was to look at the Native American branches and to make sure that the Native American branches branched away from Asia about 15,000 years ago. Why did they say that? Because archaeology, paleontology, geology have established prior to this point, in their view, that the Native Americans first appeared in the Americas in about 15,000 years ago from Asia. And so it's actually, I think the literal quote is that it was a sanity check that they had. It's in their supplemental methods from this Nature Genetics paper in 2016 and the 1,000 Genomes Project, the Y chromosome data. They're overlaying the genetic data. They've established a priori that these conclusions about the history of Native Americans are settled, and so they got to make sure that their genetic inferences match that. So that's interesting, because then if you look at the history of other discoveries that follow from it, for example, if we say just empirically, let's try to figure out how fast or slow DNA mutates. So let me back up and just explain a foundational point here. The way the Y chromosome records history is by imperfect inheritance. So I'll tell you what's been found, and then I'll come back and explain how it was found and all that and how it relates to the bigger debate. But all we have to do basically to know how fast or slow the Y chromosome changes is to take DNA from a set of dads, take Y chromosome DNA from their sons, line up those DNA differences, count the number of differences, line up each of their DNA sequences, compare dad to his son, another dad to his son, another dad to his son, and it's very rare that mutations occur, mistakes occur in the process. You count them, and there is your empirically, experimentally derived rate at which the Y chromosome changes. That's the mutation rate, and that's, in a sense, the clock that measures the passage of time from generation to generation, and should give us then some key clues to how long ago humans first had a common ancestor. Anyway, that's one piece of data. All that to say, come back to the mainstream methods. They've already established the timeline. They have a framework 15,000 years ago for Native Americans, 200,000, 300,000 years ago for all of humanity back to Africa. All that is already established in their evolutionary conclusions, and they basically stretch or overlay the DNA data to match that. So that's a very interesting approach in the sense of it has dictated how then they've approached and handled new data that's come out. So let's just think about it from let's move assumptions aside. How could we build up conclusions about Y chromosome history step by scientific step without any of these presuppositions? And where the creationist evolutionists would agree is, how do you isolate DNA? There's basic chemistry that's involved. We agree on that. You get a sample. If someone takes a cheek swab, let's say there's DNA, there's cells in that cheek swab. You chemically isolate the DNA. You run it through a DNA sequencing machine. Out comes a sequence of DNA. All that there's in that entire process. There's no disagreement between creation and evolution. Where it differs then is the interpretation. So again, once they get that DNA sequence, they're simply overlaying it on predetermined conclusions. Actually, I should add another step here. So you get a DNA sequence. Let's say that 1,000 Genomes Project happens. They get cheek swabs, let's say, from 1,200 men from around the globe, China, India, Sub-Saharan Africa, the Americas, Europe, and so on. They get those DNA sequences, then they compare them. They run them through a computer program just because it's faster than doing it by hand. Compare the DNA differences among men around the globe, and again, this is fairly straightforward because we're all about 99% identical. It's not that hard to find differences. And you count those differences, you plug them into a computer program, you tell the computer program, spit out a graphical display of the differences, and what results is something that looks a lot like a family tree. Now what? How do you interpret that family tree? And this is where, again, there's a divergence in methods. The evolutionists will say, well, we already know from paleontology, archaeology, geology, where the Native American branches should be. We know where the human branches should connect, let's say, with the chimpanzee Y chromosome, or that the African branches should be the deepest ones. They've got all these preconceived notions that they're using to arrange where the tree starts. That's a key question. So where do you put the start of this family tree based on DNA? And then how is time measured along the tree? And so their methods are, let's see how we can line this up with what we already know, they would say, from geology and archaeology and paleontology. Now, where it gets interesting is when subsequent experiments were performed. For example, again, this is where you take dads and sons who are alive today, get their Y chromosome sequences, count the number of differences. One of the surprises for the evolutionary community is when you do a high-quality study, and I say high quality because the technology has changed, it's gotten better with time, and the cost of it has changed with time. It's gotten cheaper to do high-quality studies. In the high-quality studies, the rate of change is fast. And I say fast by evolutionary standards. They're not expecting one change or more every generation. It should be every several generations, let's say. You see a DNA difference based on their preconceived notions about the time frame of human history, the time frame of human origins, and so on. And you can read in these papers, and I have my own publication where I walk through this data, the low-quality studies, the high-quality studies. In the high-quality studies, I'm thinking of two in particular. One was a Nature paper in 2017, looking at about 150 Danish individuals, 50 families, father, mother, and child. So this was not strictly Y chromosome, but looking at all sorts of DNA changes. They omitted, they talked about all sorts of DNA rates of change. They omitted specifically the father-son Y chromosome mutation rate. This is in terms of single letter differences. That's the technical side of it. But the point being, they, in a sense, hid the one piece of data that would be strongly contrary to their views. They did put a family tree based on the Y chromosome data in that paper, and from the scale bar I was able to extract from their tree the rate of change to find out, oh, it's fast. Maybe that's why they hid the data. The more egregious example of what they've done with the data is a study where they were building a family tree from a whole bunch of ethnicities around the globe. This is about 323 individuals, I think, 2015 paper. And as a control, just to make sure their study was being done accurately, they looked at a handful of father-son pairs, and lo and behold, the father-son pairs showed again a fast rate of change, and they say explicitly in the paper, well, we know from archaeology and other fields, this is way too fast. So we're just going to apply an extra set of filters to the data because we know this must be an incorrect result. I mean, I'm laughing at it not because it's anything. It's out in the open. They put it in print in the supplemental method saying, well, we know this can't be true. There wasn't anything dishonest about it. They're up front saying this can't be true based on what we know from geology and or geology, paleontology, archaeology, and so we'll just filter out data that doesn't fit. And this is, again, I don't think some grand scheme. It's just what they take for granted. So what I've done is to say, wait a minute, what if we just take the results at face value? What if the rate of change is actually fast? Well, lo and behold, it actually takes you back to Noah in about 4,500 years, number one. Now, the evolutionists might come back and say, well, how do you know that the rate of change that we measure today has been consistent throughout history? It's a valid question. It's a question creationists have been asking of evolutionists in other fields of science for a long time, and they basically shut that discussion down. Now, of course, when it comes out and it comes against evolution, it's fair to ask that question, apparently. There's tests you can do to measure that. Basically, it has to do with the history of population growth, which I won't get into the technical details, but was able to validate that the rate of change has been consistent. There's been multiple independent lines of evidence where we're just building our case basically from the ground up, instead of saying, well, we know the world has to be this old, or that the universe must be this old, or Native Americans must be this old, that sort of thing. When we build the case from the ground up and don't filter out data because it doesn't fit our preconceived notions, you get a very different perspective of history. It really is a case for the creationists of following the data where the evidence leads, because going into this study, I didn't have any preconceived ideas, let's say, about how fast or slow DNA should change. Yes, I know that from Scripture, humanity should be about 4,500 years going back to Noah, 6,000 years going back to Adam and Eve, but how does that play out in the DNA sense? The Scripture doesn't tell you how fast or slow DNA mutates. Could there have been times in the past when DNA mutation rates were faster, time when it was slower? There's just all sorts of hypotheses that flow from the scriptural framework that I didn't have answers to, and I had to derive basically from the ground up. And so it's been a wild ride of, oh wow, this fits a basic, straightforward interpretation back to Noah. Oh wow, this is additional confirmatory evidence of this, and so on. And anyway, to make a long story short, we finally got to the point where we detected at the base of this tree. So for creationists as well, we have to answer the question, where does the tree start and how is time measured? And you can see through the sequence of papers I published, it was a process of answering those questions. That, again, the first two papers were dealing with the father-son mutation rate. Oh, look, it's fast. And yes, I can confirm with population genetics, the history of population growth, that it's been consistent throughout history. But in those papers, I did not have a beginning. I used the data to say, well, I think the beginning is somewhere around here. It wasn't the African branches like the evolutionists say, but it was basically just purely on the data. And over time then, over several years, was finally able to find, oh, here's the exact beginning, because we found at the base of this Y chromosome family tree the exact replica of the Genesis 10 genealogy. So Genesis 10, of course, is a genealogy of men. It's Noah, his sons, and their sons over multiple generations. And Y chromosome DNA, of course, is male inherited DNA. It's a record of paternal inheritance. There was an exact match. So it's been a thrilling journey. And I'd say one of the main differences then between creation and evolution, to get back to your original question, as to what defines these two models. The evolutionists have constraints based on over a century and a half, probably 2 centuries if you go back even before Darwin, as to how old the Earth is, how old humanity is, where humanity should begin in Africa, and who they're what are the species are most closely related to. And that has, in a sense, forced them down certain paths and forced them to exclude data where it doesn't fit, whereas creationists come in with a different set of presuppositions, lots of open questions. We've built the case from the ground up, and the reason I continue to chase this is because it keeps working. That's the ultimate standard of whether something's true or false in science. Does it keep working? Does it make predictions that keep working? I've seen it happen over and over again, and that's why I keep chasing it.
So I'm actually curious. Again, mostly the conversation I'm in is the conversation between Christianity and Islam. And classical historic Sunni Islam is fundamentally also a creationist worldview, right? They also believe all life comes from Adam, with at least a recent creation of Adam, and also all life coming from Noah. I'm actually curious how many Muslims actually you interact with in Answers in Genesis, in your role there. Like, do you get to have a lot of conversations with them who are interested in this kind of thing, or do you kind of like not hear from them?
I've had a surprising amount of interactions with Muslims in North Africa, in the Middle East. I actually had a conversation with a member of one of the Gulf Coast royal families, and discovered, in a sense, after the book came out, we started doing videos on YouTube and invited people for future participation. The intense amount of interest there is in the North African, Middle Eastern world in terms of genealogy, connecting back to Noah, to Ishmael, to Muhammad, and so on. And surprised as well, as you mentioned, yes, they are creationists, and surprised to hear from them, because I'm so used to being in the secular, atheistic type Western world, that when they came to me, it was actually a good thing that I was a Christian and a person of faith, and this was all viewed as a bonus, as a positive, as an asset to what they wanted to investigate, which is again the complete opposite of anything that I would hear in the West, in secular academia, that's all a negative thing. You're supposed to hide it. You're supposed to not talk about it because it makes you biased. And so we've had very interesting conversations. I've discovered, I guess, along the way some of the, I don't know if I want to call it blood feuds, but there's very intense debates as to who the true Muslims are and who's truly from Abraham. And I try to stay out of some of those debates and just give objective answers. But
blood feud is fair.
Yes, there's intense discussion, and I've had very helpful conversations because a number of them have said things like, well, you have to be aware of such and such data set, or hey, I know of, for example, in Family Tree DNA, there's I think 7,000 or 8,000 Saudi Arabian samples that are part of their public database of 200,000 men, the vast majority, of course, from European descent, but because it was a U.S.-based company, now I think it's based in Australia, but anyway, there's a lot of Saudis, and one of my contacts in the Middle East was saying, be careful of some of those because there's examples of people, again, because this is such an intensely important question to them, where they're afraid of having the wrong Y chromosome result, and so they'll ask someone else who's done a Y chromosome test and has the quote-unquote correct result to submit on their behalf. So it's not actually their DNA result, but they want to end up in the quote-unquote correct lineage, and so they'll, in a sense, falsify some results because it is so important, so much emotional, familial, cultural weight placed on the correct result. So it's been interesting to see all that.
Yeah, that totally tracks. I mean, that's really important to some of them over there. I had a friend who was a direct descendant of Faisal, the Sharif of Mecca during the sort of British revolt against the Ottomans, who himself would claim direct lineage from Muhammad. And because of that, this family was so close-knit, it caused several genetic problems in the family, which was, a real tragedy in that family. So, yeah, I guess honestly, Muslims reaching out to you makes a ton of sense to me, because I would say the Muslim community with sort of creation, evolution, genetics and stuff is kind of where the Christian world was maybe 40 years ago, where you have people who are in the sort of academy and then people who believe the source materials, and those people very rarely actually mix or have any serious interaction. So I don't think there are a ton of serious-minded Muslim scientists right now who both believe the Islamic sources and are actively working in fields like genetics. So that Muslims would find answers in Genesis and be interacting makes a ton of sense to me. So elephant in the room here. Muhammad claims to be a direct descendant of Ishmael. So my question is there any way of proving or disproving that? And what are the avenues we have for exploring that? And is there any evidence one way or the other for this?
I'd say a couple of broad answers and then some specifics. Number one, the Y chromosome test is a very finicky test in that it records strictly unbroken line of male descent. So I've had a number of these conversations with my contacts across the ocean who get a result that perhaps is not what they hoped for. And I'll say you might still be related to Muhammad or to Abraham, but the Y chromosome may not record it, because you can have, let's say, 50 generations back to Muhammad, and 49 of the 50 are strict father-son links. One generation of father-daughter throws the entire analysis off, and the person I'm speaking to, their Y chromosome is going to be the result of whoever that daughter married. That's how finicky, I guess, in a sense, that type of testing can be. So you have to know with crystal clarity, 100% accuracy, this is my generation back, each generation, each step. There can't be any uncertainty to know how can we test this. So that's one limitation in a sense, or that's just the reality of Y chromosome testing. To be able to know then who did Muhammad come from, what's the link to Abraham, you need to have someone who has a very strongly validated linkage, strictly father-son, strictly paternal, back to Muhammad, test his Y chromosome, and then in theory you could get the answer. I am skeptical.
That doesn't exist, because Muhammad didn't have any sons.
So now we have no way of knowing this, or you'd have to find a brother or someone else. That's the limitations. I know that, just to give an example, so just a personal side note here, when I first was, I guess, became aware of the blood feuds that revolve around this, or very strong sentiments that exist on this topic in question in the Muslim world. I felt a little bit reticent, I guess, to keep going because there's such intense passion about it. And then once I found out that I think it's the King of Morocco and the King of Jordan, each claiming descent from Muhammad, but each having different Y chromosome results, I thought, okay, I'm not creating the controversy. I'm just walking into a pre-existing one. This is okay. One of those two gentlemen must be wrong because they can't both be right if they have different Y chromosome tests. So back to the question of how theoretically could we test Muhammad's linkage, you'd have to have someone who'd have some sort of genealogically verifiable paternal link back to his family or to his father somehow. That's in theory what has to be verified on paper. Then test someone today who would have that sort of link and test their Y chromosome, and then see does this line up with what we now know about is the lineage of Abraham.
So basically, I suppose what it can go to, though, is it would go through the lineage of Ali, who Muhammad is related to already. So if Muhammad's sons come from Ali, then there is a legitimate link back to the pre-Muhammad past on a patrilineal side.
In theory, yes. Again, I feel like with a number, and I'm just thinking again from my experience with European descent people, because I'm not as familiar with the paper trail in the Middle Eastern and North African world. A number of folks who've done a whole lot more paper genealogical work than I have, trying to trace their own family trees. One guy I remember talking to in particular, he said the trails he's traced for his family line tend to go dark about the 1200s. Or what stuck with me is the Black Death happens in the 1300s, and that's when we see a significant genetic change in Europe, where the indigenous European lineage seems to become a minority, and the migratory lineages from Central Asia become the dominant lineage, where there's, I think, a bonanza of marriages and population growth after the Black Death. Anyway, something like that happens, and I think that would naturally make it difficult to follow a paper trail back in time because there's such upheaval on the continent. And then you have to also ask the question, what sort of records are being kept before the 1200s or so? What's going on in the Middle Ages? How much do people actually care about this? Anyway, and also you think back to that time of how well could you establish the veracity of these records? How many records, because people have been sinners all throughout human history, and people like to hide sin, paternal dads who aren't supposed to be in the family tree, or who's exactly, those sorts of questions, the embarrassing questions that have come up all throughout human history. How could you establish in AD 1000 in Europe that this person on paper who you say is your dad is actually your dad before genetic testing, that sort of thing? Anyway, those are the types of questions that come to my mind when I think of Europe. I think those are valid to ask in the Middle East and North Africa, and I've had Muslims tell me, saying, well, there's already a controversy, there's so much weight we put on our genealogical descent that during earlier eras, and I can't remember if it was one of the Turkic ruling eras or a different one, there are known rulers who falsify their genealogies just to try to assume a mantle of legitimacy to rule the Muslim world. So if that's already known, then I feel like there's some added skepticism that has to creep into any discussion. Anyone who says, yep, I know for sure this is my strictly unbroken male line into Muhammad's family, I'd say, okay, well, politely, let's take a look at all the links to make sure we know this is true. And anyway, I think what I'm coming around to is being able to test Muhammad's linkage back to Abraham today is a difficult question. I don't know if we're going to be able to solve it in the near future.
Okay, so there's kind of like two different versions of this in the sort of Islamic sources that I don't think people quite realize the way these things are at odds with each other. One is this idea that Ishmael and Abraham founded Mecca and built the Kaaba, and you kind of have Ishmael's descendants living in Mecca the whole time. That does not fit with the biblical narrative of things, because that's not where Ishmael goes. It's not who Ishmael marries. The story is completely different. Like in the sort of Hadith version, right, in the Islamic sources, Ishmael is a like a child. He's being carried in a girdle by his mother. In the Bible's account of things, Ishmael is like 17 when he gets sent out. He's basically a man at that point. And he goes to a different place and he marries an Egyptian woman, whereas the Hadith says he marries an Arab woman later. Now, however, the classical Muslim scholars will trace Muhammad's lineage, and they all say you can trace it from Muhammad to a guy called Adnan, who's seen as the sort of father of North Arabia, and from Adnan to Kedar, who is one of Ishmael's sons. Now, the Kedarites, at least, right? So the Kedarites are a known people group, both historically and biblically and in Arabian culture. And so they basically say Adnan comes from the Kedarites, and we don't know the exact lineage between the Kedarites and Ishmael. So they're kind of, the early Muslim historians are honest about that part of things. But it kind of basically frames frames Arabian genetics is sort of the north central Arabs all come from Abraham via Ishmael. And then you've got these other groups of people, say Midianites, a place called Dedan, which is modern day Al-Ula, also mentioned in the Bible. And then South Arabia would also be through Abraham, through his grandson Joktan or Yoktan or Katan, as the Arabs call him. How much of that can we see in the genetic data, like that we have access to, or has that all been lost as well?
I would say, as a general statement, we have very little insight into ancient history, but it will grow with time. So let me back up that and justify that statement I just made. One of the things the research I've done has shown is, and this was part of the building the case for my time frame and the biblical chronology from the ground up. This is known from first principles. The evolutionists would agree on it. They would disagree on how it plays out exactly, but I've been able to see how it plays out exactly. Everyone would agree in the scientific community that genetics, if you build a family tree from it, records changes in population size. What I've been able to show is it records it very precisely and exquisitely, generation to generation, consistent with how fast or slow the Y chromosome mutates. And so, all that to say, the practical ramification for us is what we see today is a product of the history of human population growth. That's kind of the first foundational principle. The DNA test results we see today are going to reflect the history of human population growth. Point number two is human population growth has a rather hockey stick shape. So from about, this is again even from mainstream sources, from about 1000 BC, the world population is so in 1000 BC, the world population is about 50 million estimated. In 1400 AD, so what is that, 2400 years later, it's 350 million. So I think that's about a sevenfold-ish factor of growth. It's not huge. And then in the last 600 years, from 1400 till now, so 350 million to 8 billion is more than 20-fold growth. There's been a huge increase in growth in the world population size in the last few hundred years. All that to say, 95% of today's branches on the family tree. So if you just take a random sample of the globe, men from around the globe get their Y chromosome branches, statistically 95% of those branches will come together in the last 600 years. That's a summary of a lot of data. But what that means is most of our data right now reflects the very recent past. That's kind of the second conclusion. DNA records the history of population growth. Secondly, most of, or a ton of human population growth has occurred in the last few hundred years, and so most of our information right now is from the recent past. And it's going to require, here's the third point, to get into the deep past. Yes, about 5% of the branches are going to connect earlier in history, before the 1400s AD. So to get really deep into history, Abraham's time, you need to do a very deep, intense sampling of the globe. So right now, what I showed and traced is we do have the line of Abraham. I think I lean towards labeling some of those branches on the tree as from Jacob. From talking to a number of Middle Eastern and North African Muslims, I realized, well, there's still a possibility, given how closely allied in the geographic sense Ishmael, Isaac's descendants were over the history of humanity. I don't think I can quite distinguish the two of them yet. There are two ancient branches back to Abraham. So how will we know more of this history that you were just describing? How will we know more about what happened to the 12 tribes of Israel? What about the tribes from Ishmael? All that will, I think, eventually emerge, with one caveat, assuming none of them went extinct. Assuming none of those male lines went extinct. So on the Jewish side of things, for the past, I think, 1,500 years or so, rabbis have defined Jewishness by the mother's ancestry. So to this day, I've got a colleague who has Jewish ancestry through his father's side, wants to get, I think, Israeli citizenship, but cannot because it's through his father's side, not through his mother's. Well, all that's going to have a huge impact then on Jewish Y chromosome results. They've been defining themselves not by their Y chromosomes, but by their mitochondrial DNA, and so that's going to have diluted that ancestral Y chromosome Abrahamic signal for over a millennium, which makes it harder to detect. And one of the things I point out in the book and traced is what I'm calling the Abrahamic line is a small minority, but this kind of fits Jewish history because they've been, by choice, diluting out that Y chromosome signal for a long time. On the Arab side, again, it's deep in history. On the Ishmael side, it's deep in history. There are studies already going on where there's thousands of Middle Eastern men whose Y chromosomes are being studied, and some of them, as the predictions I've put in print have specified, some occasional rare branches are emerging from these studies, but it's going to take a lot more intense studying, hundreds of thousands, millions of men, before the details of that history will begin to emerge. So, again, in the book, I think I was more strongly using language more strongly, hinting at this is a line from Jacob. I realize this might be Ishmael. There's some uncertainties here. It is definitely Abrahamic based on the genealogy in Genesis 10, but there's going to be a lot more study that needs to be done, Y chromosome tests that need to be done based on these math and population history principles before these ancient branches will emerge. And when those emerge, I think we can revisit the question and have more definitive answers.
So there's lots of missing details as far as Ishmael, Muhammad, but if the Bible treats Arabia as kind of Abraham as kind of like the progenitor of Arabia, and that's basically how Arabs see him as well, would you say that's more or less accurate from the data we have?
That's a good question. So let me think aloud here for a minute, because one of the challenges that we face, so my book is based on the DNA from living men. That's maybe one to go back to a question from earlier. One of the other differences between my view and the mainstream view is I think we have evidence that rejects DNA from the deceased, from burials, which of course we've got plenty of those in the Middle East. I don't think that data is valid. The mainstream community does. Anyway, so I'm doing studies based on living men, and living men represent the survivors of a whole host of historical events. And Middle East, of course, notoriously, for thousands of years, has been the crossroads of civilization. You've got one people group moving in and conquering after another. It's almost constant tumult, where Egypt lays claim to part of it early in history, if you think of strictly Middle East, Asian Middle East, Assyria, Babylon. So Assyria biblically would come from Shem, Asher, one of his sons. Egypt, of course, is from Ham, Misraim. You've got Persians and other Indo-Iranians that rule part of the Middle East. You've got Arabs. Arabic, of course, is in the Afro-Asiatic language family. Anyway, you've got very diverse peoples coming in and conquering them. And so the first question that comes to my mind is, yes, Scripture might say at that point the ancestor of these people was so-and-so, but then that chapter in Scripture closes and thousands of years of extra-biblical history transpire thereafter. And that's what also affects the DNA results of people we see today. In other words, the people we see today, the Y chromosome results, are essentially the most reproductively successful men in history. And a general rule of thumb that I've seen is last conqueror tends to win. So whoever came in and swept through and won most recently tends to leave today the biggest Y chromosome signature. So I guess to answer your question as to whether or not this plays out in the Y chromosome, I guess the short answer is it's complicated, because there's a very complicated history that follows those ancient biblical statements.
Right. So I suppose if we wanted to study this deeper, probably one of the best samples to really examine closely would be the Bedouin and people in Central Arabia. Because if you look at when Arabia is conquered. So Egypt takes, Mecca and Medina at one point. The Ottoman Empire rules over Arabia briefly as well. And you do have Persians taking some cities, Babylonians taking some cities, even Romans taking some cities. But the sort of the central desert culture is never really completely subdued. So if you could get samples of a lot of, Bedouins and people with ancestry going back to Bedouins, it seems like you could maybe get a pretty good sample of that, almost untouched, plausibly less touched genetics.
I would agree with you in theory. I feel like we've got many examples of this around the globe where these people should be isolated. I was thinking of a group in India where they claim, I think, strict descent from the Apostle Thomas or somewhere in Syria, and we've never been intermixed, and of course their Y chromosomes have been tested and they're intermixed. And this is not to cast doubt on their claims. The tricky part is one exception can throw off the math. So what I'm thinking of is, let's say you have a community where they have had very strict marriage practices to almost 99% purity. One exception from 1,000 years ago, we adopted someone in, or whatever it is. We assimilated this person.
Because this man saved my daughters from bandits at the well, and now he's marrying into the family. Exactly.
The quirky statistics of human reproduction, which again, it's, just to give an example, I'm thinking of my own family tree. My dad had 3 brothers. Which of those 3 brothers' Y chromosome is going to be in existence in a few hundred years? One of my dad's brothers had 1 son, and he passed, unfortunately, before, and he had 1 daughter, no sons. So that brother's Y chromosomes lineage seems to have stopped now, will not exist. My other uncle, dad's other brother, has 1 son who's married, but he has 1 daughter. So that brother's Y chromosome lineage might go extinct. My dad had 2 sons. I've got 1 brother, and I have 3 sons, and my brother has 1 son. So statistically, just in 2 generations, if you look at the grandchildren, my father has already a huge, a multiplicative advantage over his brothers, and that's not because of anything by choice or design. It's just, that's how it plays out. Sometimes you have lots of sons, sometimes you have lots of daughters, sometimes you don't have many children, some do have a lot of children. And so one guy 1,000 years ago can just so happen to have a lot of sons, and ends up dominating the whole Y chromosome lineages of people today, or has a much more over-representative sampling or presence in the people today. So Bedouins, I think, have been studied, and they tend to have a genetic profile very similar to others. I wish we could do what you're describing and find the answers that way, but it seems that one of the only things that keeps people from intermixing is strict geographic barriers. So that's not disagreeing with anything you've mentioned about the political history. It's just, it seems if there's nothing that keeps people apart. So just to give some examples of hard barriers and genetic pools, in a sense. Sub-Saharan Africa is kind of its own thing, I think, because it is hard to cross the Sahara with an army or to go that way. East Asia, the Chinese aren't that far from the South Asians, the Indians, yet the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau have, I think, been such a large geographic barrier to conquest, they've remained fairly genetically isolated. India is a significant distance from Europe, but there really isn't much in the way to keep them apart, and there's a long history genetically of, or I should say, forget the politics. If you look at the genetics of India and Europe, which are connected through Central Asia, and Central Asia, of course, being a hotbed of movement, there's tons and tons of genetic links between Europe and India. That's the sort of thing that's played out, which, of course, that's a long distance. And if you then kind of narrow the geographic lens to the Arabian Peninsula, it's a much shorter distance. And so I think what we see in the Bedouins, even though I would love that it played out differently, we could actually get some answers to this deeper history. It seems there weren't sufficient genetic or geographic barriers to keep them genetically apart from the surrounding peoples, regardless of the history of political conquest. So I wish it were otherwise, but there's kind of where we're stuck right now.
And they're by nature travelers and traders and stuff, right? So there's all sorts of opportunities for somebody to join or someone to leave.
Yes.
Okay, so let's move on from Arabia now. In your book, you mentioned the link between Pashtuns and Jews, right? Claimed by Pashtuns themselves. Now, what I will say is we got super involved with the new Afghan refugees moving to the Seattle area after the fall of Kabul. We've met lots of Pashtuns. I have 2 that work with our ministry, actually. One of them believes the stories, one of them doesn't. And there's different versions of the story. So the one you shared was the Pashtuns coming from one of Saul's sons. The one I've heard more is actually them coming from one of Solomon's sons. And they believe their language is the language of this invisible race called the jinns, because Pashto is not like any other language on earth, like in the way it connects to anything. So the question is there evidence that Pashtuns either come from the ancient Israelites, or that they come from Arab conquerors, or is there another explanation that we're missing, or is it completely a mystery genetically?
I'll tell you the data that we have, and then how it relates to. Let me rephrase it. I'll tell you the data that we have right now for that biblical lineage, from Abraham all the way down to the time of Solomon and such, and then how it relates to Afghanistan and the Pashtuns and such. So right now, in the Y chromosome tree, there are branches, haplogroups would be the term, and they're just assigned fairly random or arbitrary letters of the alphabet. T and L are the lineages that I've identified as Abrahamic. They're generally rare in the globe. You can find them all over the place, from sub-Saharan Africa to Europe to East Asia, Middle East, and so on. It's spread far and wide. But based on the specific genealogical details in Genesis 10, Genesis 11, which takes you from Shem down to Abraham, specific male-by-male linkages, and we can count those off in this family tree. Anyway, all that to say, we've got some very strong candidates for Abrahamic lineages. I don't have enough data yet to trace that further. Again, in the book, I lean towards, hey, these 2 ancient lineages, which T and L look like they branch around the time of Isaac or Jacob, but there's a little bit of uncertainty in the genetics, and then I don't want to overpress the data because of how longly associated Ishmael's line and Isaac's lines were geographically over the history of humanity. So I don't have data yet to say, here's David, here's Saul, here's Solomon. That doesn't exist in the data set yet. But with lots of additional testing, my hope is we can begin to draw some of that out. So we have positive confirmation of the Abrahamic line. Does that exist in Afghanistan? Does it exist among the Pashtuns? Yes, at low levels, about 6%, or I forget the exact number, but it's present, which is remarkable again, because it's remarkable to me because, again, the Y chromosome is a record of unbroken paternal ancestry. So again, let's say it's I was saying 50 generations back to Muhammad, so maybe that'd be 600 AD, let's say, ish, and going back another 1,600 years to David's time. Let's add another, just to make it a round number, 100 generations. Again, that's, let's say you can or you do have 99 generations of unbroken father-son links, and 1 generation is father-daughter. Just or you flip it around and say, how easy would it be to throw off the genetic signal of one's link back to David or Solomon? Fairly easy. I mean, statistically, it's like, yeah, fat chance that's going to still show up. And so to still have a genetic signal after 3,000 years in modern Afghanistan, I think is remarkable. So, again, if you think of the biblical history where you've got northern tribes hauled off to Assyria, and then Assyria, of course, if you kind of fast forward the reel of history, Assyria itself being conquered by Babylon, by Persia, and you think of where Persia once stretched all the way into Central Asia and all that, covering lands that are now Afghanistan. It's plausible. It's just remarkable to me that it still exists, and so I feel like that altogether, to me, lends credence to there being an ancestral link back into the biblical record for the Pashtuns.
So there seems like there's 2 possibilities for this, though, because there's 2 different stories, right? So one is that it goes back to Solomon or Saul, and the other is that it goes back to a guy called Qais, who is one of the sort of early Muslim Arab generals. So plausibly, that could point either direction, right? It could point to Arab lineage 1400 years ago, or it could point to Jewish lineage 2600 years ago.
Yes, absolutely. Those are two legitimate possibilities. I guess I'm saying I still think it's remarkable that the possibility is not yet refuted by genetics of there being an ancestral link back to Israel. Sure. Is it, if we say what's the most parsimonious, what's the most likely, given the way history has played out, that it probably has some Arab link, it may in fact be an Arab link. But I don't have data yet to distinguish between these two, and that's what's so very interesting to me.
So if we have Pashtuns listening who want to actually find this out, how would they go about doing that? How much Pashtun DNA do we need here?
That's a good question. And just thinking aloud again, I don't know that it's going to be strictly Pashtun, just because we have, again thinking aloud of how things have played out globally, we have thousands of years of history we're trying to cover. And geographically, the kingdoms that come and go throughout that region over those thousands of years cover a lot of area. So I do think to get more detail on what are these T and L branches actually represent is going to require a deeper sampling of the whole Middle East, just because there's so much movement back and forth throughout history. It could plausibly, the clues could plausibly end up almost anywhere. It's what I guess I'm suggesting here as a strategy is a bit more of a brute force, not in the physical sense, but in just sheer numbers of volunteers from all over the place. And I think actually at early stages it's probably wiser to cast a broader net, because we don't know a priori where is this lineage going to show up, because so many there's uncountable numbers of ways the genealogies could have played out from a mathematical sense. And so cast a broad net, and then if something empirically pops up like, oh, northern Iraq just so happens to have this very rare lineage at high concentrations, let's dig deeper there. Or maybe it is the Pashtuns who end up, wow, they have an unusual abundance of ancient lineages. We should sample even more intensely there. So I feel like that's a wiser strategy of start broad, and then if something pops up empirically, you can dive deeper there. But I suspect these are going to be fairly well distributed, because where we do have history that we know and genetics to match it, that's just how it's played out.
Okay, so let's move now from the Afghanosphere to the Turkosphere here. So there was a well-known Turkish Afghan poet and sort of academic and teacher named Ergesh Uchkun, who was active with the Northern Alliance in Afghanistan. He was very prominent in the 80s. And I know this because I worked directly with his son, Ibars. And Ergesh Uchkun very strongly believed in a genetic link between the Turks and the Native Americans. What would you say to that? Is there any linguistic, biological, genetic evidence for that?
I'll deal with the linguistics because there's a lot of change that I think needs to happen. And then go back to the genetics because there's some really exciting data there. In terms of linguistics, let me back up and give a big picture as to why. So I guess the short answer is no. At face value right now, there are not linguistic links between Asia and the Americas. But here's the bigger picture. I think the linguistic data are ripe for reanalysis. So I'm going to approach this from a biblical perspective, but I think there's a good case to be made here. My position on Genesis 10 and 11, thinking again about the globe and how languages relate to all this, you have one language, one speech, Genesis 11 verse 1, which makes sense because this is right after the flood. Noah and his family have stepped off the ark, and it's family. So of course they're going to be speaking one language. There's no need for additional languages. They're all related. God commands them to spread out, fill the earth. They say, nope, we're going to build a tower, a city, we're going to make a name for ourselves, we're going to stay right here. So God confuses their languages to force them to spread out. And I think Genesis 10, one chapter prior, lists the names of the heads of the initial ethno-linguistic groups. There's still questions I have about Genesis 10 because I'm told some of those names are singular nouns, some of those names are plural nouns, some of those names are adjectives. I don't know why that exists, but my working model for Genesis 10 is it's about 70 names, and those 70 about the initial ethno-linguistic groups. After Babel, there's a lot of additional language diversification that happens, so that we now have over 7,000 languages in the world today. But what's interesting to me is if you look at the language families, groupings, so I think I alluded to these earlier. English, that we're speaking right now, is part of the Indo-European language family. My mother's German, I grew up speaking German, and I can see some of the concept of a language family, because I remember we were in Germany one time watching a Norwegian wedding. They were speaking Norwegian, and if I listened really hard, I almost could understand what they're saying. We've been in the Netherlands. Of course, they speak Dutch. And again, you can almost, as a German speaker, understand what they're saying. There's similarities that hint at common ancestry. So English is part of the Germanic subgroup of Indo-European. Anyway, there's language families. The total number of language families in the globe today is about 150. That's not 70, but that's a whole lot closer to 70 than 7,000 is. What's even more interesting is the majority of language families in the globe today are found in the Americas. So I think there's been an overclassification of Native American language families. They're an outlier in a sense. So is Papua New Guinea, or that region of Melanesia, where there's an abundance of language families compared to the geographic area. So I'm no linguist by training, but I would love to see a linguist kind of grab the bull by the horns and see if there are indeed linguistic links between. So first of all, are there more linguistic links? Can we reduce the number of language families in the Americas? Can we find more connections among these diverse peoples than is currently accepted? And then once that's done, might there also be links into Asia that we didn't notice before? So to summarize then, no, there are not currently recognized linguistic links between Turks or Central Asia and the Americas, but I suspect there will be some discovered in the future because of this odd statistical outlier that American languages represent. Secondly, in terms of genetics, there are very clear genetic links between Central Asia and the Americas. In the evolutionary timescale, again, they, in a sense, are forced to punt that date, that link, into the incomprehensibly distant past, 15,000 years ago. When you reanalyze these data basically from the ground up, which happens to confirm the biblical worldview, you find that there was a migration from Central Asia into the Americas about the 400s AD, and this very specifically links you to Central Asia. One of the main branches or haplogroups in the Americas is this haplogroup Q, again just an arbitrary letter of the alphabet. I think about 60% of the Turkmens in Turkmenistan belong to the same branch. So there's most definitely links there, and I can say specifically that the Native American migration from Asia into the Americas around that time was clearly linked to the Hunnic, the migration of the Huns into Europe at the time of the fall of the Roman Empire. There's another migration from Central Asia into the Americas about the 900s AD, and this is another time. Actually, this is really interesting because this gives you a much more direct link to the Turkic peoples, because this was the time of the. So Magyars are not Turkic peoples, but they were Central Asians, ancestors of the Hungarians that came into Europe about this time. But there's Kipchaks and others who are part of the Turkic language family who move from Central Asia towards Eastern Europe. They actually end up being ancestors of the majority of Western and Eastern Europeans today. And that's the exact same time when there's another migration from that region, roughly, into the Americas. And I even though they're not necessarily the same branches on the family tree, they come from the same region. And so there's abundant evidence to link Turkic peoples from Central Asia to the Native Americans. In terms of genetics, we have additional migrations I've discovered with mitochondrial DNA, but these seem to be a little bit more linked to Eastern Asia, and I don't yet have the full picture for Central Asia. But that statement and that supposition of there being links between Turkic peoples and Native Americans is most definitely confirmed by genetics.
Okay, so first of all, if you need like Turkmen DNA, I have like so many Turkmens I can introduce you to. It's ridiculous. One of our board members is kind of like one of the founding fathers of the church in Turkmenistan. He's great. Obviously, the idea of having like large migrations from Asia to America in like 400 and 900 AD, like, seems insane to the sort of secular academy and everything we think about the past. Putting aside how, like, jarring that feels and how intriguing that is, I'm actually, this is right, just my own question here, because I've been, like, obsessively looking into this since watching your videos and reading your books. So what I'm most interested in here is, what you're charting is the red record, which some people find dubious, but you're supplementing that with a lot of other Native American oral history, pointing back to this, like, it's kind of starts in Alaska, then moves down from east to west. What I'm actually really curious about is, where the heck do these people disappear from in Central Asia? Like, and I know that's difficult because we don't even really know where the Huns come from themselves, but it seems kind of... So I'm curious if there's a way we can kind of, like, link these people leaving Central Asia to getting to the Americas. Like, who were they before they crossed?
Yes, that's a good question. And let me think of the Y chromosome data, and then I can think in terms of the recent mitochondrial data. And I think all of this answers actually a number of questions. You're mentioning the shock this is for the mainstream community. I think part of what alleviates the shock is it makes sense in terms of what we know about historical migrations and movements of peoples. And just as a general statement, I think it's helpful to, and it's something I remind myself of all the time, Central Asia not being as conducive to agriculture is conducive to pastoral ways of life. Pastoral ways of life naturally keep you on the move and force you to be adaptable. And that has played out in a very strong way in the Americas, where the descendants of the Central Asians who came over have thrived from the Arctic to the Amazon. Dramatically different environments, but they've adapted and survived and thrived very well. So that, I think, speaks in a sense to the Central Asian past, and it really was actually initially going to try to make a point here about is Central Asia has a long history of being on the move, and so trying to figure out who they came from is a little bit like trying to hit a moving target, almost literally, because they're constantly on the move. Again, I think because of this environment in which they find themselves, it's a pastoral environment, and so that kind of puts people on the move. With regards to the 400s migration in AD, I say it's that link from the Americas to Central Asia is directly to the Huns, because we have in Europe the same branch at the same time at a very low level. The Huns weren't here in Europe there that long, so it kind of fits, I think. But I can find the genetic echo in Europe of the Huns being there, and it branches off, same branch with the Native Americans, the one that became the Native Americans, over in the Americas. So there I think we've got fairly clear genetic linkages we can establish. We should, in theory, be able to do the same thing with the 900s migration. It is from a branch that, in terms of the overall branch, not the specific sub-branch that it branches off, because I don't have enough detail yet, but it's haplogroup C. C is very strongly Mongolian today, and it may have something to do with the peoples that were up there at that time. I can't narrow it down quite yet. And let me pause that story for a moment to bring in some of the mitochondrial data, because I think, again, in terms of general movements and politics, there are clues even before I get the final answer. So the reason I'm hesitating on that 900s migration is because there isn't much published full Y chromosome sequence data on that migration. From what we do have, I've been able to make these inferences, but to nail down specifically who was it, there just isn't enough data out there yet to say so, but I think we can in the near future once it comes out. Politics and other things I think are helpful clues. So just to back up a minute, it was interesting to me that the dominant lineage in the Americas stems from this migration about the 400s, even before I was able to directly link genetically to the Huns. I noticed that this is a period for Central Asia called the Völkerwanderung, the German word for the great wandering of peoples. It's already known there's something brewing, stirring in Central Asia, because the Huns just happened to be going into Europe at that time. The Shanbai and others are going the other direction into Asia. There's people have talked about, I think, about environmental factors or climate change, but that seems to be the favorite fallback for everyone these days, so I tend to be skeptical. Anyway, something's going on, that there's a lot of movement. I'm like, well, is it any surprise then that someone would also just keep going east and finally end up in the Americas? Similar thing then, I think, for the nine. So my point is, we've been able to confirm that genetically, link it to the Huns, but it was preceded by a curious correlation between known historical migrations and then one that ends up in the Americas. Again, for the Middle Ages, the 900s AD or so, we've got known documented migrations, specifically of Turkic peoples, into Europe. I don't know the reason why. These are not necessarily things I grew up learning, but I had to learn after the fact, but they're in the books. And I've got very clear for Europe genetic linkages and connections to those known historical migrations, Kipchaks and others. And so is it any surprise then that the people would go the other direction into the Americas? And I'm forgetting the Chinese history that might correlate with this. So let me add in two more other migrations I just discovered this year. After the They Had Names book came out, I published a paper in July. They Had Names came out in May. There's a migration that happened, and I can detect this again with the female inherited mitochondrial DNA, about the 100s BC into the Americas. And I can tie it to interesting events that happened over here, archaeologically. The great city of Teotihuacan in Mexico began its sudden growth, basically, right about that time. Well, the lineage genetically takes me back to Northeast Asia. And what's interesting to me is that the centuries preceding that were characterized by the dominance of the Xiongnu. The Xiongnu were among the more famous sort of northern barbarians, might have some sort of Central Asian linkage as well. The northern groups who would harass the Chinese, and one of the reasons they were needing to build a great wall to keep them out, well, they were successful, and the 100s BC is when the Chinese finally began to push them back out. And my impression is, when you ask the question, why would people want to go to the Americas, I think there's sort of this general pattern of there's a crisis, whether it's agricultural, pastoral, some sort of cultural crisis, because we can't feed ourselves, we have to go find food elsewhere, or political crisis, which I think fits this case, where the Shanbai lose, well, where are we going to go? Well, we heard there's empty lands over there, or whatever it is. It's plausible to me. So I think we can make a connection there, and I feel we can make a strong case that it's specifically the Xiongnu that are the ancestors of, in the Americas, Teotihuacan. Anyway, there's really interesting correlations that pop up here. Then there's another migration of 1000 BC, which, in terms of East Asia, it's very early. That's the transition from the Shang dynasty to the Zhou dynasty, and there isn't a lot. It's still in the period where you don't have a ton of information for Chinese history, let alone Northeast Asian, Central Asian history. But genetically, there is a migration out of that region. I can see this with the Y chromosome. Out of that region, down through Japan, through the Philippines, across the coast of New Guinea, into the Pacific. Ultimately, it gives rise to the Polynesians over several thousand years. But there is a migration genetically. I can tie that to as well. So anyway, my point is there's a lot of correlations with other genetic events, with historical political events, with cultural upheaval, and this is a new place. I didn't have a lot of these answers just even 5 years ago, because I scratched my head, what can I tie this to? But the answers have emerged to me in a very exciting and satisfying way over time, and I think we can make a very strong case, and I think it'll only get stronger with very specific peoples. They came from this group. I think we should be able to say in the next few years.
Okay, so I suppose a couple points on this is that, like, people might ask, well, how is this chapter deleted from North Central Asian history? But there is no North Central Asian history to be deleted from in the first place. Like, I was looking into the linguistic ties, myself, and there are some words, but people chalk those up to coincidence, right? So the word kayak, for example, is small boat in Turkish and Native American language. People, it's not a big enough, you can have some duplicate words with unlinked languages. But there's no trace, for example, of the Hunnic language in the first place. Like, there's no record of it because there's no writing system. And I guess the other thing that I found is that there have been like trade links between like Alaska and Siberia since they've never stopped, as far as I can tell. Right, it seems like there has been links between Inuit communities in Siberia and Alaska. So there's no point. There's absolutely unbroken contact between America and Asia in human history. So if hypothetically, you have 10,000 of a sort of Hunnic group, which is like trying to get away from the more violent Hunnic group or something, and and they're like, all right, where can we go? So, well, I know a guy. He talks about this continent he visits for trade, and they just pay a guy to. This is entirely plausible that people from Central Asia could get to America if they knew the right person, because the right person did exist all throughout human history. So essentially, it simplifies it a bit, but it seems like it makes sense of some of the data, because you've got early on in the Americas, you have these sort of city-building, sedentary cultures, which kind of seem to give way to these later nomadic cultures which arise. So there's almost like two really clear waves of culture there, but you're saying there's far more than that, plausibly.
Based on genetics, there were at least 5 migrations from the Old World into the New before Columbus in 1492. It was a very dynamic place, regular links between the two. It raises the question, of course, did Native Americans go back? I don't know the answer yet, but that's, I think, something we can put on the table as a matter of further exploration.
Okay, well, so again, so anybody who's watching this and wants to kind of explore, run with this, dig deeper, explore the history here, how is the best way for them to do that? Like, where can they find your work, and how could they actually get involved in your work?
Yeah, so the sort of the one-stop place to get the history of North America before Columbus, as we currently understand it, is this new book, They Had Names, Tracing the History of the North American Indigenous People, which just came out in May. You can find it on Amazon. You can find it on I work for Answers and Genesis. We have a web store. There's other places that the publisher, New Leaf Publishing Group, sells it. There's a map that goes with it too. You can download it. You can contact me directly through answersandgenesis.org/go/they-had-names. That has that big map of North America at contact. Plus, if you scroll down, you can find a way to enter name, email. Goes directly to my inbox. I've contacted people that way. There's a YouTube channel that Answers and Genesis has. If you go to, I think it's at Answers and Genesis or something on YouTube. I've got several playlists that deal with this history. We did a whole playlist on Traced, so the global DNA history back in 2022. We've got a couple playlists now, one that's ongoing, one on the lost history of North America that was kind of the prelude to the book, and I'm doing a series on They Had Names that kind of gives the history chapter by chapter for the book, or multiple chapters together. So there's lots of outlets to find more information. It is ongoing research. I'm currently in the throes of trying to figure out Central American history. Like I said, I just made a discovery this year on mitochondrial DNA. That's something on our website you can keep up with. I am on social media like Facebook, Twitter. I think we got in touch, or X now is what it is. We got in touch that way, and I try to keep people abreast of things, discoveries as they happen. A way to contact people directly, but also to just broadcast when discoveries are made, or hey, we need help with this part of the project, or hey, if you know someone who's involved in this, could you have them contact me, that sort of thing. So lots of ways to keep up to speed, or to surface level, dive deep, whatever someone wants to do to explore this topic.
Well, Dr. Nathaniel Jeanson, have been really enjoying reading those books and looking into your work, and it's really fascinating. It's kind of like opened up this whole sort of new interest in Native American history to me, because I think the way it's presented is frankly boring by sort of secular academia. And what I would say, if there's any Native Americans listening to this, there may be some innate suspicious about the British guy and American guy talking about Native American history. And what I'll say with Dr. Jeanson's work is that it is the secular academics who are dismissing your history as mythology. Like, obviously, not every aspect of Native American history can be true. In the same way, not every aspect of European history can be true. But what this work does is actually taking seriously Native American accounts and actually trying to use them to help make sense of the past. So I think anybody who's interested in this can learn something from reading this book. Obviously there's still lots of research to be done, so I hope more and more people get involved with it.
Me too. Thank you.
And thank you for being on the Almighty Initiative podcast. We'll be back next time.